Hello lovely patrons! In this exclusive video, we will talk about electric impulses, the effects of certain drugs on our neurons, and we will briefly mention how our vision works. On our last video, we talked about synapses and how electric impulses are passed on from neuron to neuron until they reach the brain. Today, we will explain a specific type of synapse in more detail, called a cholinergic synapse. Synapses are named based on which neurotransmitters are released, when they reach an action potential, that is. As you may remember, the neurotransmitters are chemical molecules that carry information from one neuron to the next. These chemicals are released into this gap between two neurons called a synapse, and then they enter the next neuron in line, which in turn causes that neuron to depolarize, so the impulse can be passed on until it reaches its destination. So these cholinergic synapses have this name because the neurotransmitter that they release is called acetylcholine, or ACH in short. This is the major neurotransmitter released in synapses. This neurotransmitter is mostly released in synapses that are in between two neurons, or in synapses that are in between a neuron and a muscle fiber. The latter is the one that we are going to focus on today, and these are called neuromuscular junctions. Like we mentioned in a previous video, for an impulse to be passed on through neurons, the threshold for the action potential must be met, thereby inducing ion channels to open and calcium ions to enter the neuron. The impulse then travels through the axon until it reaches the axon terminal, and then the neurotransmitter ACH is released into the synaptic cleft by exocytosis. When this neurotransmitter is released into the cleft, it then binds to special ACH receptors on the cell membrane of the muscle fiber. This then causes the muscle fiber to depolarize, just like a neuron does, opening up ion channels and allowing sodium to enter the cell, which in turn causes that muscle to contract. And this is what happens every time you contract a muscle. Now let's see what happens to the transmission of electric impulses when we're under the effect of certain drugs. When you take drugs, whether they are prescription or recreational drugs, they have an effect on your brain. With some of them, you can get confusion, hallucinations, forgetfulness, relaxation, etc. But how exactly do these drugs act on our neurons, and how do they affect the transmission of nerve impulses? Drugs can be split into two groups, depressants or stimulants. Depressants does not mean that they make you depressed, it just means that they suppress and slow down normal brain function. This is true for alcohol, tranquilizers, and opioids such as heroin and morphine. Stimulants, on the other hand, stimulate brain function. They speed up the nervous system. Some examples of stimulants are cocaine, caffeine, and amphetamines. Like I mentioned before, neurotransmitters attach to specific receptors. Think of these receptors like a company's car park spaces, which are marked specifically for certain people. So if you're the CEO of the company, then you park your car in the CEO space. If you're the accountant, you park the car in the accountant space, etc. Similarly, neurotransmitters and other chemicals have specific receptors that they bind to. So ACH has specific ACH receptors it binds to, and this is true for drugs as well. See, we have loads of different receptors in our bodies, and we produce certain chemicals which are very similar to some drugs. So we've got opioid receptors because we produce natural opioids such as endorphins in our bodies. We've got cannabinoid receptors because we produce endocannabinoids. So if you think of that car park with marked spaces, If someone was to park on the CEO's space when they're not there, and they've got the same car model, same color, and even the same number plate, so that other people wouldn't even notice that that's someone else's car, that's what happens when drugs bind to our receptors. They're so similar to the chemicals that we produce that they just bind to those receptors without problems. But there is a difference between the reaction we get when we take drugs compared to when we produce drugs. And that is because those receptors can be stimulated on different levels. So the receptors we have for endorphins are the same ones that heroin binds to. But heroin stimulates these receptors a lot more than endorphins do, which is why your body reacts on different levels. So let's now finally talk about the effects of drugs on the brain. Let's start with cocaine. This is a stimulant drug, so it increases brain activity. And it does so because cocaine binds to a dopamine receptor. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter which is important for mental and physical well-being. It is involved in mood, sleep, memory, learning, motor skills, and much more. So it's fair to say that it's quite an important chemical. When cocaine binds to dopamine receptors, it means that dopamine then can't bind to those receptors, so it starts accumulating in the synaptic cleft. So imagine that car park with loads of unwanted visitors in the marked spaces, and the people who were meant to park in those spaces are now queuing up in the car park, unable to go to work, because they don't have anywhere to park their cars. This buildup of dopamine in the synapses leads to an increased response by the body, so pleasurable feelings are heightened and the senses become heightened. LSD is another drug that we'll look into. LSD is also known as acid. It is a man-made drug that causes hallucinations and causes the person to have a different perception of the world for a period of time. LSD is very similar to another neurotransmitter called serotonin. This neurotransmitter is involved in regulating moods, happiness, anxiety, and it is also involved in other bodily functions such as digestion, sleep, etc. Because LSD and serotonin are so chemically similar, LSD ends up binding to serotonin receptors, and it binds to them more easily and faster than serotonin itself. It has more affinity to them than serotonin. Strange, isn't it? Anyway, when this happens, the same occurs where serotonin is no longer able to bind to the receptors that have been taken up by LSD, so it queues up in the synaptic cleft. The LSD then sends impulses to different parts of the brain, which creates a heightened response, including hallucinations. Marijuana, or weed, acts in the same way. THC is the main component of weed that creates psychoactive effects, such as increased appetite, the giggles, reduction of pain, etc. We have our own endocannabinoid system in our bodies, so we produce chemicals that are very similar to the cannabinoid components of weed. So when weed enters the body, it binds to the receptors of those endocannabinoids, which then creates heightened responses such as the munchies. Finally, to finish off today's video, let's have a look at how we see things and how our brains respond to that information. As you can see from the picture, our brain turns the images that we see the other way around. So if you look at both your hands right now, your left hand is on the left side and your right hand is on the right side. But in your brain, your right hand is on the left side and vice versa. Confusing, isn't it? This is because information from different parts of the visual field are processed in different parts of the brain. So in the picture, you see the nerves that carry information from the right side of the visual field, in orange, actually travel through the left side of the brain, and that is where they are processed. And the same is true for the left side of the visual field, in purple. We don't need to get into too much detail, so let's just see the components of this complex system. It all starts in the eyes. The information travels through the eye to the back of it, where the retina is located. The retina is a thin layer of tissue which converts the information received by the eyes into neural signals, which can then be sent to the brain to be interpreted. So the retina receives the information, converts it, and then this information travels to the brain through the optic nerves, which start near the retina and travel all the way to the part of the brain that deals with vision, the visual cortex. So these optic nerves that come out of the eye carry information from both sides of the visual field. But this information needs to be sorted, so to say, as we now know that only some of it goes to the right side of the brain and some to the left. So these nerves cross at the middle in what is called the optic chiasma. And this is where the nerves carrying information from the right side of the visual field travel to the left side of the brain, and vice versa, until they reach the visual cortex at the back of the brain. And that's the end of today's video. Next week we will talk about other parts of the brain and our nervous system. I hope to see you again next week. Have a great weekend.